Hi everybody and welcome back. Last time we went over what I believe are the 6 different animal archetypes in Super Auto Pets. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, you can check out this video first. And today we're gonna dive into one archetype in particular, the buffer. First we'll go over the role that the buffer plays, as well as some general information about how to use them, what makes a good buffer, as well as tips to look out for. Alright, so let's just get started here. The buffer is a very easy archetype to understand. It's a unit that buffs other units, but it's not very good at combat itself. Good examples of buffers are the monkey, penguin, and poodle. It's easy to see that all these animals play a similar role in your team. They all help you get stronger over time and keeps your team relevant in the late game. But before we move on, I would like to generalize the definition a little bit, because buffers don't need to buff animals directly. What? What does that mean? Well, rather than directly granting stats to a single animal, I think a buffer is just any animal that makes the team stronger by a set amount every turn. Or in other words, consistent scaling. By this definition, animals like the swan can also be considered buffers. Whereas they don't buff your animals, they nevertheless provide your team with a steady gold income every turn, indirectly buffing your team by giving you more resources. Since buffers provide scaling every turn, the longer you have a buffer on your team, the more value they provide. Another way of thinking about this is, the earlier you get a buffer, the better it is. I'm sure this is somewhat of an obvious point, but if you want to buy both a buffer and some food from the shop, but you only have enough gold for one of them, then buy the buffer this round and buy the food the next round. Because you'll be able to get the buff this round and the next, whereas if you buy the food, you miss out on the end of round buff for one turn. So that was a summary of the characteristics of the buffer, but how do you apply those concepts in practice? Because buffers are better the longer you keep them, you want to buy them as early as possible and hold on to them for as long as possible. This means that sometimes you want to sell units that are stronger just to keep buffers on your team. Buffers usually start appearing during the transition from early to mid-game, so around turns 4 to 7. And that's when you should try to sell units that don't scale well and replace them with buffers, even if the unit you're selling has decent stats. This is because you need to focus on crafting a team that's strong throughout an entire run, so you need to take a bit of risk from time to time. There will be turns where you should sell a strong animal to invest in long-term scaling. It will make your team weaker that turn, and you might even lose a turn or two as a result, but it's a risk that you should take in order to build a strong team for the late game. The higher the risk you take, the more potential your run has to make it to 10 wins later on. And remember, health is a resource. It doesn't matter how much health you have, as long as it's not 0. So if you have a lot of health left, you should be playing riskier, because you can afford to lose a couple of rounds. And remember, you don't need to build an insanely strong team every turn. You only need to build a team that's stronger than your opponents. If you can get away with winning by a single unit, that's actually better than winning by many units. Because if you win by a lot and you've got a strong unit that didn't even get to attack, then what is that unit even doing? Why is it on your team if it didn't need to attack at all? It might as well not be there, right? And in its place, you could have put a swan or a giraffe that's buffing your team. But wait, you say, what if the enemy is too strong and I need that unit to survive? I need to keep it just to be safe, just in case. Well, that's the trick, right? The trick is balancing how many buffers you can have with how many strong units you need in order to survive. In my opinion, this is the hardest part of the game, and it's what you need experience for. You need to use your experience to judge how strong your team is compared to how strong the average enemy team is every turn. You can take a big risk and be greedy and buy a lot of buffers on your team, but you might lose a lot of health that way. Or you might play safer in the early to mid game and keep all your high stat units, but you might lose in the late game if you don't get to 10 wins before your units start to scale off. These are the types of decisions that you need to make every game, and every game's gonna be different. You have to adapt to the shop that you're given, and that's why this game is still fun for me, even after so many hours. Another reason why you shouldn't sell the buffers on your team is, in the early to mid game, a lot of tempo units are interchangeable. I'm talking about units like the kangaroo and the deer. You don't need to upgrade a kangaroo for it to be decent, so don't be afraid to sell a level 1 kangaroo to fit a buffer on your team, because you're very likely to roll another kangaroo the next turn, or an ox that does the same job, or a deer that's going to be just as powerful. Whereas there are a lot of serviceable tempo units around, buffers are much rarer, so if you sell them you might not get another one for a couple of turns, and those are all turns that you're missing out on buffs. If you lose a tempo unit, even if you don't find a good replacement, the worst that can happen is that you lose a turn. Yes, that's not good, but you didn't do any permanent damage to your team's development. You can buy another tempo unit and be back at your full strength again. Whereas if you lose out on a buffer for a couple of turns, those buffs are never coming back. So yeah, buffers are really important in the early to mid game. You want to buy them, keep them, upgrade them, and balance them on your team. But what about the late game? Well, it's a bit different in the late game. Your strategy of buffers in the late game should depend on your win count. As we've said, buffers are great for scaling, but what if you don't need any more scaling? As you approach 10 wins, buffers may become less and less important, because if you're sitting at 9 wins, you don't really care about getting consistently stronger anymore. Well, not until the devs add an endless mode. Teamwood Games please. Anyway, as I was saying, if you only need one more win to finish the game, consider selling your buffer to replace it with a good trader like a skunk or a scorpion. Your team will get a nice power spike that can help you end the game decisively. The buffer also has a positive side effect. Because it's a weak unit, they can often play the role of a designated survivor, that is, a weak unit at the very back of the team, so that when the rest of the team trades with the enemy team, your buffer can sit tight at the end to claim the victory. Another benefit to having a weak buffer in your team is it acts as a free target for your opponent's snipers. For example, an alligator or a dolphin. The buffer can just take the hit, die from it, and it shouldn't affect your team that much as it was the weakest unit anyway, and it doesn't do much in combat. Now let's talk about what makes a good buffer. The first thing we should look at is, of course, how big the buff is. For example, a level 1 dragon gives you +5/+5 across your entire team, whereas a level 1 giraffe only gives you +1/+1. So in order of how impactful the buffs are, the dragon is definitely better here. But of course, that's not the only thing we need to look at, because the giraffe is a tier 3 unit, which means it's available on turn 5, but a dragon is a tier 6, meaning it only comes out on turn 11. This is quite a huge difference, since getting your buffer as early as possible is so important. So the giraffe isn't actually that bad compared to the dragon. It's more an issue of one being a mid-game buffer whereas the other is a late-game one. In other words, we have to account for the animal's tier when judging buffers. But we're not done yet. Think about a level 3 giraffe that buffs 3 animals by +1/+1, and compare that to a level 1 monkey that buffs a single animal by +3/+3. Which one would you rather have? The answer can change depending on context, but for me, I would rather have the monkey as a general rule of thumb. Why? Because of how fast the buff is. If you have a buffer that can apply buffs very quickly to a single target, then it gives your team a lot of flexibility. For example, if you see a leopard in the shop, you can easily buff it up to be a good unit if you had a monkey. Whereas with a giraffe that only gives the leopard +1/+1 every turn, the game will probably be over before you get a strong leopard. The faster you are able to get buffs out onto a single unit, the easier it will be for you to change your team composition in the later game. And the final thing to look out for when comparing buffers is the constraints that each buffer has. For example, a constraint for the monkey is that it can only buff the first unit. This means that if you're running a turtle or a scorpion in position 1 that you don't want to buff, a monkey can be an awkward unit to fit on your team. Other constraints, for example, are the penguin only being able to buff level 2 units and above, the poodle only being able to buff one animal from each tier, and the dragon needing you to buy a tier 1 unit, and so on. So there we have it, the 4 things I look for in a good buffer. Buff size, tier, speed, and constraints. With this criteria, you guys should be able to decide on which buffers you want on your team for each situation. But I've also gone ahead and put together a tier list for what I thought the best buffers were. And here it is. I felt that talking about each individual animal one by one wasn't super interesting or informative, so I'll just leave the tier list here. And if you disagree about some of my choices, feel free to let me know down in the comments. One thing I did want to note is that you'll notice animals like the cow, otter, and beaver on this list. They're commonly used as food animals, which means you'll often buy them and sell them on the same turn just to receive their buffs, but you can also use them as buffers if you keep the animal around. Because when you keep the animal around, you have a chance to level them up in order to get even better buffs. Then they can be considered buffers in a way, because you are keeping a weaker animal on your team in order to get a bigger buff later on. So in this tier list, I'm ranking these animals specifically by their potential when used this way. For example, a cow would be considered an S tier animal if we were thinking about them in terms of food, but in this tier list it's only a B tier because that's how good I think it is if you try to keep a cow on your team just to get better milk. Great, so that was a more detailed look into buffers. Hopefully this information can change the way you think about the game a little. As always, I just hope I've given you more to think about as you continue to experiment with your builds and make your own decisions in the game. And if you think this guide has been helpful to you, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more. Thank you as always. Bye bye.